Imagine a land brimming with grain, its granaries reportedly overflowing, yet its people dying by the millions. This wasn't a medieval nightmare, nor a distant forgotten epoch, but the stark reality of British India in the late 19th century. Between 1876 and 1878, a catastrophe of unimaginable scale unfolded, a famine so profound it claimed more lives than many of the 20th century's devastating wars. We are talking about anywhere from 5.5 million to 10.3 million deaths, some estimates reaching as high as 12 million. Yet, unlike the Irish potato famine or the Holodomor, this event, often termed the Great Famine of 1876-1878, remains largely absent from mainstream historical consciousness. And the crucial element that differentiates it from a mere natural disaster? Its colonial context. This was not simply a consequence of failed rains, though drought certainly played a devastating initial role. It was a calamity exacerbated, transformed, and ultimately magnified into a monumental human tragedy by the policies and priorities of the British Raj. Our journey into this period will dissect the intertwined natural phenomena and colonial governance that created what historian Mike Davis famously termed late Victorian holocausts. The geographical canvas for this horror stretched across vast swathes of British India. The Madras Presidency, the Bombay Presidency, Mysore, Hyderabad, and the United Provinces bore the brunt, with distress spreading to parts of Punjab and central India. Simultaneously, across the globe, similar climactic disturbances were triggering famines in northern China, northeastern Brazil, and parts of Africa, suggesting a wider environmental pattern at play. This pattern was the consequence of an exceptionally strong El Niño event, known as the Great El Niño of 1876-1878, which disrupted monsoon systems and global weather patterns of an unprecedented scale. In India, the stage was set by an agrarian economy overwhelmingly reliant on the erratic monsoon rains. Most of the population lived in rural areas, engaged in subsistence agriculture, with limited reserves or safety nets. The British had by this time laid down an extensive railway network, ostensibly for development and famine relief. However, this infrastructure was primarily geared towards facilitating the export of raw materials like cotton and wheat to Britain, and the rapid movement of troops, rather than consistently ensuring internal food security. Furthermore, land revenue policies, which demanded fixed cash payments regardless of harvest success, and the expansion of cash crops over traditional food grains had already significantly increased the vulnerability of the rural poor. The catastrophic sequence began with the failure of the southwest monsoon in June 1876. This initial failure was followed by a similar lack of rain during the northeast monsoon later that year, and crucially, another failure of the southwest monsoon in 1877. 2 successive years of severely deficient rainfall, targeting the very heart of India's agricultural calendar, were sufficient to devastate standing crops, cripple sowings, and deplete vital water reserves. Wells dried up, grazing lands turned to dust, and cattle, the lifeblood of agricultural communities, began to perish en masse. As grain argus plummeted, prices skyrocketed, quickly moving beyond the reach of the vast majority of the population. People began to sell their meager possessions, pawn their jewelry, and mortgage their land, all in a desperate bid to acquire food. It was against this backdrop of escalating natural disaster that the colonial administration's philosophical and policy decisions truly transformed a severe drought into a genocidal famine. The British government in India, under Viceroy Lord Lytton, was deeply steeped in the prevailing economic doctrines of laissez-faire capitalism and Malthusian theory. These ideologies posited that government intervention in the market, especially through relief efforts, was not only economically unsound but morally perilous. Providing relief, it was argued, would create a moral hazard, fostering dependency, undermining self-reliance, and interfering with the natural process of population control, a euphemism in practice for allowing the poor to die off. The underlying conviction was that famine was an unavoidable natural check on population growth, a concept that provided a convenient ideological justification for minimal intervention. As the specter of famine began to loom large, the official response was characterized by stringent financial austerity, a commitment to free market principles, and a deep-seated suspicion of widespread relief efforts. This ideology, which placed colonial economic imperatives and abstract economic theories above human lives, would dictate the fateful decisions that followed, turning what could have been a manageable crisis into one of humanity's most harrowing chapters. The stage was now set for the millions of deaths that were not merely unfortunate, but fundamentally engineered by policy.
The summer monsoon of 1876 failed catastrophically across large swaths of India, particularly the Madras and Bombay Presidencies, Mysore and Hyderabad. The parched earth yielded no crops, and the stored reserves from previous harvests quickly dwindled. What began as a severe drought swiftly escalated into a full-blown famine, yet the response from the British administration, under the newly appointed Viceroy, Lord Lytton, remained chillingly consistent with the doctrines laid out. Lytton, a staunch proponent of classical liberal economics and a firm believer in the dangers of state intervention, arrived in India with a clear mandate: maintain financial solvency, uphold free trade, and limit relief expenditure. His administration's immediate actions starkly illustrated the deadly consequences of these ideological commitments. Rather than declaring an emergency and halting grain exports, a significant volume of Indian wheat and rice continued to be shipped to Britain and other parts of the empire, even as food prices soared domestically, rendering basic sustenance unaffordable for millions. The market, it was argued, would self-correct. Intervention would only disrupt natural supply and demand. This adherence to laissez-faire principles, in the face of mass starvation, ensured that food, though scarce locally, was not entirely absent from the subcontinent, but rather priced beyond the reach of the vast majority of the afflicted population. Relief efforts, when grudgingly implemented, were designed to be as minimal and unappealing as possible, adhering strictly to the principle of less eligibility, that conditions on relief works should be worse than the lowest paid ordinary laborer, to deter malingerers and prevent the moral hazard of dependency. These were not programs to save lives efficiently, but rather to test the desperation of the dying. The famine codes, embryonic at this stage, dictated a system of productive relief works, grueling manual labor like road construction and irrigation projects, for which starving individuals were paid a pittance. One of the most infamous instances was the implementation of the Temple wage, named after Sir Richard Temple, the famine commissioner. This wage was set so low, often providing just 1.5 pounds of grain per day, barely enough to sustain life for an adult performing strenuous manual labor, that it was effectively a death sentence for those already weakened by hunger. Temple, despite witnessing the horrific conditions firsthand, remained convinced that any more generous provision would encourage idleness and financial ruin for the government. His reports, initially alarmist, gradually shifted to emphasize the perceived success of stringent economy, often downplaying the true mortality figures. The impact on the Indian populace was immediate and devastating. Villages emptied as people abandoned their land in desperate search for food and water, migrating en masse towards perceived centers of relief, or simply wandering until they collapsed. Sanitation broke down completely in makeshift camps, and the weakened populations became incredibly susceptible to epidemic diseases. Cholera, dysentery, smallpox, and malaria swept through the subcontinent, claiming lives with horrifying efficiency, often outnumbering those who died directly from starvation. Disease was not merely a secondary effect. It was the inevitable grim reaper for bodies already hollowed out by hunger and exhaustion. Families sold their jewelry, their tools, their tattle, and eventually their children, often for a few handfuls of grain. Traditional social structures, which typically provided safety nets during lean times, crumbled under the relentless pressure of unprecedented scarcity and the colonial state's active suppression of indigenous relief mechanisms. The British suspicion of local charities and community efforts, deemed inefficient or corrupt, removed vital avenues of support. As the crisis deepened through late 1876 and into 1877, official pronouncements often painted a picture of a crisis under control. Lytton's administration was more concerned with maintaining financial probity and its image than with acknowledging the scale of the unfolding tragedy. Reports from local officials who dared to highlight the devastating mortality were often met with skepticism or outright dismissal. The priority remained the financial health of the empire and the economic principles it championed, not the survival of its Indian subjects. The government's own statistics, when eventually compiled, consistently underestimated the true death toll, a pattern of denial that would tragically persist. This period marked a profound moral failure, where abstract economic theories and administrative parsimony were ruthlessly prioritized over the fundamental right to life. The stage that had been set was not for managing a crisis, but for observing a Malthusian experiment unfold on a grand, terrifying scale, with millions of Indian lives as the unwilling subjects. The deliberate choices made in London and Calcutta transformed a natural calamity into a man-made catastrophe, ensuring that the suffering would continue, and indeed intensify, before the full horror of the famine finally ebbed. The relentless march of death was now an established reality, and the world watched, or perhaps more accurately, looked away.
The relentless march of death was now an established reality, and the world watched, or perhaps more accurately, looked away. When the monsoon of 1877 failed again, the already precarious situation across Madras, Bombay, Mysore, and the central provinces plunged deeper. Initial failures to intervene decisively let the crisis metastasize, transforming scarcity into widespread starvation. What followed was sustained horror, etched into India's collective memory as unparalleled colonial betrayal. Viceroy Lord Lytton, architect of Britain's parsimonious response, remained unyielding to strict economic orthodoxy. His administration saw famine relief not as a humanitarian imperative, but as a dangerous precedent fostering dependency and undermining market principles. London's prevailing intellectual current, influenced by Malthusian theories and classical economics, posited large-scale state intervention as financially imprudent and morally misguided. Too much intervention, it was argued, would prolong suffering by encouraging overpopulation and indolence. This chilling logic, rooted in a perceived inevitability of population control through scarcity, provided a convenient intellectual veneer for inaction, justifying limited intervention even as millions faced certain death. Relief efforts, where they existed, were deliberately unappealing and demeaning, ensuring only those on death's brink sought them. The infamous famine codes, later formalized, were already informally applied. Workers on relief projects received starvation wages, barely enough to sustain themselves, never their families, nor to regain assets. Test works were often miles from villages, forcing weakened individuals on arduous journeys, frequently resulting in death before arrival. Relief camp conditions were appalling, disease ran rampant, and the meager rations, sometimes 1 pound of grain daily for an adult male engaged in hard labor, were woefully inadequate, calibrated to sustain life at the barest minimum, not to restore health. Women, children, and the elderly often received less, or were denied relief entirely if not deemed capable of strenuous labor. This limited liability policy stood in stark contrast to British practices when famine struck Ireland or white majority colonies. For India, a different set of rules applied. As millions withered and died, Lytton's administration proceeded with the opulent imperial durbar in Delhi, January 1877. This lavish spectacle, held to proclaim Queen Victoria Empress of India, was a jarring display of imperial grandeur amidst unimaginable human suffering. The Darbar's expenditure, estimated over 10 million rupees, enough to feed millions for months, attested to the Raj's priorities. While subjects starved, their ruler was celebrated with fireworks, feasts, and parades, a grotesque testament to colonial indifference. Long-term consequences extended far beyond the immediate death toll. Entire communities were decimated. Families lost land, livestock, and savings, plunging them into intergenerational debt from which many never recovered. Agricultural infrastructure, the backbone of Indian society, was severely damaged as farmers ate seed grain, sold plows, and watched cattle perish. The demographic impact was profound, not just in millions dead, but in millions more with permanently compromised health, vulnerable to subsequent diseases and future scarcities. The famine acted as a brutal Malthusian cull, orchestrated by policy, not nature. Estimating the true death toll remains contentious, largely due to Britain's attempts to minimize figures. Contemporary British official estimates ranged from 5.5 to 6.1 million deaths, widely believed conservative. Later historians, using demographic analysis and accounting for underreporting, placed the figure much higher, often between 8 and 12 million, with some estimates reaching 15 million. This colossal loss of life, concentrated in a few regions, transformed a severe drought into one of history's deadliest human disasters, dwarfing many great Chinese famines in per capita mortality. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 was not isolated, but a brutal manifestation of an imperial system designed for extraction and control. It exposed the moral bankruptcy of a colonial power that mobilized vast resources for war and imperial display, yet refused to save its subjects from starvation. It left an indelible scar on the Indian psyche, fostering deep distrust of British rule and fueling the nascent nationalist movement. Figures like Dadabhai Naoroji later articulated the drain of wealth theory, linking famines directly to British economic policies, siphoning resources from India. Echoes of this catastrophe resonated for decades, shaping subsequent, albeit imperfect, famine relief policies and forever altering the colonizer-colonizer relationship. It stands as a chilling testament to the devastating consequences when abstract economic dogma and imperial hubris collide with the fundamental human right to sustenance. The world indeed looked away, becoming an unwitnessed witness to one of history's most tragic and avoidable man-made catastrophes, a stark reminder that history, however boringly presented, is often deeply unsettling. The legacy of those forgotten millions demands we not only remember their plight, but profoundly understand the systemic failures and ideological rigidities that condemned them to a brutal, preventable demise.